Tower of David, as they call it. So I don't. the other places are too noisy. Can you see?
Absolutely. Well, I preferred the building
like
in the car parking lot. That was more interesting to me.
The what?
I'm saying the building in the car parking lot. That actually,
do you want to see Christ Church, but not in New Zealand?
no, not really.
Yeah.
You wanna teach us?
Okay, yes. Okay, so I'll tell you something from today's parasha. Today's parasha was Shoftim, which means judges. And one of the things in the parasha was judges have to be beyond reproach and they cannot accept a bribe. Usually bribe would be given to a judge to rule in the briber's favor. And even if a judge gets a gift from one of the parties with no strings attached, he shouldn't adjudicate the case. It says so, I read in the commentaries. So that's because judges, it leads to a corrupt society. It adds to corruption. Unfortunately, this is the world we live in, and as you know, it's one of the 7 Noahide laws, where there's got to be a legal system in place of justice. Justice should be in place. That's one of the 7 Noahide laws. So that would detract from it and would lead to unfair rulings. It could also a judge could also rule in favor of a poor person if he feels sympathy. So a judge has to be totally unbiased in his or her verdicts or judgments.
It's true.
Hey, put me on mute because I'm going to start walking to the bus stop. Okay.
Arth, would you like to read the Mishnah if I share it on the screen? Or are you on your tiny phone? Okay. Are you feeling all right, Arth? You look a bit tired.
I'm exhausted. I work today as well. I wasn't supposed to work, but the client had a bar mitzvah. So I said, okay, the whole family wasn't going to be there. Nobody. So okay, I'll fill it. So I worked all week. I slept till I came out. I'm exhausted.
Sorry, mate. Well, look, I'll try and keep this interesting and keep it short. You know?
No. Keep it normal. It helps me sleep.
All right, excellent. I'm going to share the screen. Share the screen. Just give me 1 second. And I want Gavin to read.
I'm also on a small screen. It's not going to be great, but I'll do my best.
Okay, but you're a good reader. You careful. Go for it.
I'm just turning it sideways. The Mishnah continues the discussion concerning the payment for humiliation. One who humiliates a naked person, humiliates a blind person, one who humiliates a sleeping person is liable to pay for that humiliation. But a sleeping person that humiliated someone else is not liable. And if one fell from a roof and injured and humiliated another person, he's liable for the damage. But he's not liable for the humiliation. In sum, one is not liable for humiliation unless he intends to injure.
Okay, so some of those things are obvious. There's just a couple of issues I want to clear. Is that we learned in Bava Kamma in the 27th daf, in Aleph, if you remember, that the case involved a person that was blown off the roof by a normal wind. It was a guy that was either working on his roof or decided to just relax with a beer on his roof, and he was blown off. And he's liable then for damage, which is damage, which is nezek, tsar, which is pain, healing, which is refuah, and loss of employment, which is shevet, the recovery period, but not for humiliation. Okay? Because had the fall been caused by an unusually strong wind, for example, he'd actually only be liable for nezek. The very fact that he had to pay for medical bills, pain, and loss of employment means that, if you remember correctly, he should have imagined that there could have been a normal wind. So because of that, there is a certain amount of negligence, but obviously not for the humiliation aspect. Now, it's slightly different if you remember the 27th daf. If one's falling from a roof and he now wants to flip himself over or land on a person in order to cushion his blow, he is doing it to save himself from serious injury. That's a given. But the critical factor, Gavin, if you look at the last point, is that it's not the intent to humiliate somebody that only makes you pay for humiliation. It's the intent to injure. That's the chiddush in the 27th daf, as well as at the bottom of our Mishnah, is that for the intent to injure, you pay for humiliation. And what's the source of it? Is if you look at Deuteronomy, chapter 25, verse 11, it talks about two guys like fighting in a bar or whatever, and the one guy's busy hooking and smacking the other guy, and the woman of the husband that's being assaulted sends forth her hand and grasps his embarrassing place, his privates. And it implies that she intended to act intentionally. So, okay, so she might have wanted to create humiliation, but the more realistic interpretation is that a woman is not going to be able to affect a guy with a couple of drinks in him unless she grabs his privates and pulls his nuts to where his eyes nearly pop out. So that's intent to injure. And in that particular case, that's what creates her having to pay for humiliation. It's the intent to injure. So that's the unique factor. Obviously, the intent to humiliate generates payment for humiliation. I mean, that's pretty clear. Bless you. So now the Gemara elaborates on the Mishnah, and the rabbis taught in a brisa, and it's now elaborating on this part about what happens if one humiliates a naked person. What does this mean exactly? So the rabbis taught in a brisa, if one humiliates another while in the another Jew while the latter was naked, he is liable. But humiliating him, Gavin, are you sick at the moment? Oh, it's somebody's making a. I don't know if the noise is coming from Arthur's side or Gavin's side.
No, it's not my side. It's
but it's weird though because it's not my side.
I'm on mute, so it can't be my side.
And it can't be Kevin because Kevin's muted. But something's very wrong.
Okay, just mute me, but there's nothing else.
Okay. All right. Seems to be better, Gav. I don't know. It might be something peripheral. It's not serious. It's not intentional. If it's not intentional, you don't have to pay me for humiliation. Falling asleep in the shear is intent to injure. So Arthur, stay awake. Okay. Guys, all right. So if one person humiliated another while the latter was naked, he is liable. But humiliating him naked is not comparable to humiliating him clothed. So I always thought that initially that meant that if you humiliate somebody when they're naked, the humiliation is far more than humiliating somebody clothed. Okay? But it appears that that's not quite the case, because the Gemara's commentary on note 8 in the Schottenstein discusses that a naked person is already in a compromised position. So since he suffers less embarrassment than does a clothed person, and because he would not pay as much as a clothed person to avoid being humiliated, one who humiliates him is liable to a smaller amount. Okay? Now that bothered me, because how could it be that somebody that's naked feels less humiliation than somebody fully clothed? Because we've got self-esteem and bodily issues. So what are we talking about being embarrassed in the marketplace or in the market? What we're saying here is something a little bit different. But the Schottenstein doesn't actually say it. In fact, it goes the opposite. Upon further investigation, I couldn't get clarity on this, but my thought is that if you pull somebody's pants down in the marketplace where they do business or something that's public, that's far more humiliating than spitting on them when they're already in a bathhouse, because in a bathhouse, everybody is naked. So if somebody's got self-esteem issues, they're not going to go to a public bathhouse. The very fact that they're prepared to do that means that they've got already enough self-confidence to be naked amongst others, as everybody does. So having somebody naked in an inappropriate place creates embarrassment more than if you create something of embarrassment where everybody is in the same physical disposition of nakedness. But the caveat here is that's my interpretation. because the Schottenstein doesn't make sense. It's inferring the opposite. Note 8. So you're more than willing to come back and criticize me, but that to me makes sense. And the reason I'm basing it is on the rest of the Gemara. Because the Gemara challenges the Bryce's the first ruling of the Bryce. And it says, Master said, Bryce has stated if one person humiliated another naked, he is liable. But is a naked person capable of experiencing humiliation? And mean, it basically says if he does not mind walking around naked in front of other people, what could somebody do to humiliate him? That's according to Rashi. So that's what I'm basing it on. So the Gemara answers, Rav Papa said, what does the Bryce mean by naked? Not that the victim appeared in public shamelessly disrobed. Rather, what happened was that a wind came and bunched up his clothes. Okay. In other words, in former times, men wore these long tunics without pants. And when the wind came, it lifted the victim's tunic. He was partially exposed, only partially. Okay. And then what happened in that particular case is the assailant came, lifted it more, and thereby humiliated him. So in other words, the victim demonstrated no lack of self-respect because it was normal to bathe in the river, and then you slightly pick up your pants where your thigh is exposed and you start to wash it with a bit of soap. But in this case, he exposed him further by the other person pulling his tunic completely up. Now, according to the Shitei Mekubetzes, it adds that the assailant also exclaimed a verbal declaration saying, hey, look at so-and-so, who stands here naked? So, in other words, it's not only a physical demonstration that he shows his nakedness, but he also makes a disparaging statement. Tosfot, on the other hand, suggests that where the victim himself raised his garment somewhat and the assailant lifts it higher, the latter incurs no liability. Okay, but it's obvious that if the person didn't want to be naked to that degree, for sure there's humiliation. So that's different to a bathhouse. So the Gemara challenges the Bryce's second ruling, okay? And the Bryce states if one humiliated another in the bathhouse, he is liable. But it's saying, is somebody in the bathhouse capable of experiencing humiliation? And that goes exactly to my point of how I interpreted previously that seem to infer the opposite. In other words, people normally disrobe in a bathhouse and feel no embarrassment, according to Rashi. Why? Because then it's asked, how can somebody feel humiliated in a bathhouse? If you've got enough self-confidence within your body to be in that area, and everybody's naked, it's not as if it's in the marketplace where everybody's clothed and one person's nakedness is exposed. So, in other words, also the Rashi brings that in that case, the victim has demonstrated no lack of self-respect by appearing naked in the bathhouse, because he would certainly suffer, obviously, embarrassment if he was slapped or spat on there, as he would when he was fully clothed anywhere else. But since the Bryce's first case concerning humiliation through exposure, the Gemara assumes it's obviously a possibility to humiliate somebody by exposing him in the bathhouse where everybody is naked. Okay, so it's trying to get to grips with the issue. So the Gemara answers, Rav Papa said, what happened is that the assailant's humiliating the victim by exposing him at the river while he was bathing. In other words, the bathhouse mentioned in the Bryce is obviously a river that people sometimes bathe, but due to the public nature of the place, people don't disrobe fully. You know what I mean? They wash themselves and take piece by piece, but their privates aren't exposed. So in that case, they're making a discernment between a bathhouse where everybody's naked and a public place where there's some nakedness exposed, but not to the same level of degree, and they're comparing that with a marketplace where nobody's naked, and if somebody's exposed, the payment is quite higher. So the Gemara posed a question regarding the payment for humiliation, and it's a completely different thing about the nakedness now. As Rav Abba Bar Mamal inquired, if one person humiliates another while the latter was sleeping, and that person died in his sleep, without ever realizing that he'd been humiliated, what is the law? So where do we get this from? Is because, as Gavin read, the first statement in the Mishnah is one humiliates a naked person. We've just dealt with that. The next statement is one who humiliates a blind person. We're actually going to deal with that next. And the third statement is one who humiliates a sleeping person. Now, I'm not sure why the Gemara is dealing with the sleeping person first. It usually deals with it in order of the Mishnah, but obviously there's a reason. So what is Rav Abba Kamma's inquiry? Is, okay, it's a person that's sleeping. He died in his sleep. He never realized he was humiliating. So what is the law? In other words, the Gemara is saying, well, look, it seems kind of a little bit puzzling. In other words, Mishnah teaches that you obviously are liable for humiliating a sleeping person. But that's when the person wakes up and learns of that humiliation. Maybe he wakes up and he's got egg or shaving cream on him, or somebody's done a smiling face. You've seen these YouTube videos when somebody's fraught drunk and they draw on him, or they make that person really humiliated when they wake up. So the issue is whether person's heirs, if a person dies in their sleep, can collect compensation for their father's humiliation. It's pursuant to the rule. And you remember that rule, guys, where the heirs collect all damage payments owed to their father. So in this particular case, if the father died in his sleep and he was humiliated, are the children entitled to get damages actions from this act of humiliation? But it depends on certain factors. Because Rav Zavid said, this is what the Gemara is asking. Is it because of the feeling of embarrassment suffered by the victim that an assailant is liable for humiliation? And this victim died without having any feeling of embarrassment. Because if he never had that feeling of embarrassment, and that's the issue at stake, there's no payment to the heirs. Because it's a subjective feeling. If he died, he wasn't aware of being embarrassed in his sleep. Or maybe perhaps Rav Zavid said it's because of the public degradation to which he subjected the victim that the assailant is liable for humiliation. And here the assailant degraded his victim even though the latter was unaware of it. And I like to use that YouTube example because today it could be that they do a video of somebody and the person actually overdoses from his alcohol consumption and dies, and the YouTube video already came out live or on TikTok or whatever the case may be. Is the family embarrassed? Is that the issue at hand? Or since the victim died of alcohol poisoning in his sleep, never woke up, and he never suffered any personal humiliation, is there payment due to him, at which the heir, or if not him, the heirs? So that's the issue at case. Okay. We're gonna be dealing with that. So the Gemara attempts to answer the question. Kabb learned from the following brisa that the assailant is liable in Rav Abba Kamma's case. Rav Meir said a deaf person and a minor have compensation for humiliation. A deranged person does not have compensation for humiliation. Now, it's all very well if you say that a person is liable for humiliation because of degradation, because this is why the brisa states that a humiliated minor is eligible for compensation, because the assailant's act, in fact, degrades him. But if you want to say that liability for humiliation is because of embarrassment, is a minor capable of experiencing embarrassment? Certainly not. Now, Gavin brought up a good point the other day, is that with bullying, there is such a thing as humiliation. So what we're talking about here, Gavin, is the fact that the minor is analogous to a sleeping person. If a minor is young enough, not a case where he's bullied by his peers, because that is mental, psychological, or physical abuse. We're saying that maybe an adult says something to a 3 or 4-year-old, a real minor that can't comprehend that he's being insulted. That's the analogy it's used. In other words, he feels no shame, but his stature is diminished if somebody humiliates him. So since the brisa decrees liability for the humiliation of a minor, we've obviously got to conclude that its reason was the victim's degradation, not his mental processing of the degradation, because a minor isn't always capable of seeing maybe nuances or something as far as that's concerned. According to Rabbi Meir, he's different. He says we're all children of Avram Avinu, And that's why there's degradation, not because he will comprehend it, but because he's a Jew, even if he's a minor. So the Gemara challenges that proof. It says, look, what's the reason for liability? Because of degradation. If so, he should be liable for humiliating a deranged person as well. In other words, accordingly, a deranged person can't experience embarrassment, but a humiliating act nevertheless degrades him. Why then does the Bryce exempt the humiliator of a deranged person from liability? Unless it's a fact that, so if you want to say it's a fact that he's still degraded even though he mentally can't process it, why wouldn't he make a payment to a deranged person for degradation or their family, or selling the family name? That's a relevant point. It's a good argument to this. So the Gemara deflects the challenge and said, look, if you're looking at a deranged person, you have no humiliation greater than this, hence it's impossible to degrade him further. So what it's actually saying is that if you've ever known anybody with dementia, or Alzheimer's, or severe mental retardation, they're already at a state of embarrassment by their mere medical condition. And since that's a result, the entire situation is already one of embarrassment. Whether people are around or not, they make pivotal, how do I say, pivotal embarrassing scenarios all the time. In other words, they get, sometimes if they don't process correctly, they get aggressive, do socially inappropriate things. The entire situation is one of embarrassment, which the family has to get used to. So this person is not going to make a dent in their current situation. So therefore, it doesn't count. The entire situation is embarrassing. Now, the Gemara returns to the argument because in any event, let us derive from the Brisa because of degradation that one is liable for humiliation. In other words, degradation is an objective way to determine a person's loss of stature as opposed to a person's feeling of embarrassment. Okay? So the Brisa obligates one who humiliates a minor, and the Gemara says it can retort, is a minor capable of experiencing embarrassment? Surely not. But if you remember, the Gemara refutes the proof with the argument that Rav Papa brought across last time we did at the session on Thursday night. It said, look, if you're dealing with a really, really young minor, they're not capable of processing the level of embarrassment because they've missed the nuance. But if you're talking about a minor mature enough, in other words, less than 12, but certainly old enough to be able to fathom what was said to them and feel embarrassed as a result, then that minor becomes embarrassed because he's old enough to see consequence and significance. So the question is, how mature is he, both intellectually and emotionally, to be able to process the degradation that's done to him? So Rav Papa said, not a blanket rule that a minor doesn't feel embarrassment. It really depends on the age of the minor. So we still haven't answered the question. So the Gemara attempts to answer the question. It says, come learn that the assailant is liable from the following brisa. A deaf person and a minor have compensation for humiliation, according to Rabbi Meir. A deranged person does not have compensation for humiliation. Now, it's well if you say that one is liable for humiliation because of humiliation of the family. And that's why the Brisa actually states that a humiliated minor is eligible for compensation. And we're talking about a really young minor that can't absorb the consequence of what was said to them. But the family can. So therefore, the family, in fact, has been discredited and degraded. So there we understand. But if you say that the liability for humiliation is because of the victim's embarrassment, is a young minor capable of experiencing humiliation? Surely not. So the Gemara challenges the proof. It says, but what then is the reason for liability? In other words, is it because of the humiliation of the family members? If so, one should be liable for humiliating a deranged person as well. Why should the Brisa state otherwise? So So the Gemara answers, look, with regards to a deranged person, that's not a reasonable assumption because a person is deranged, they're an embarrassment to their family anyway, even though their family's gotten used to their erratic and socially inappropriate behavior. And since that's their behavior in general, somebody remarking on it is not going to embarrass or discredit the family even further, especially because it's a genetic or medical condition. So the Gemara returns to the argument and says, look, in any event, let's derive from the brisa that it's because of the humiliation of the family that one is liable for humiliation. Let's keep the deranged person out of it. But if you say it's because of the victim's embarrassment that the brisa obligates one who humiliates a minor, I can retort, is a minor capable of experiencing embarrassment? Guys, the Gemara is going backwards and forwards a little bit. Today we would probably say it in a, much more summarized way. But Rav Papa again says, listen, there are minors that won't process it, that are too young, and those that do. So this so far is not a proof at all. In fact, Rav Papa brings support for his interpretation from a different brisa. And that brisa states that Rebbe says, a deaf person has compensation for humiliation. The deranged person does not have compensation for humiliation. And regarding a minor, sometimes he has compensation for humiliation, while sometimes he doesn't have it because it depends on his age and his level to comprehend it. So from the brisa, the bottom line is from the brisa, we can deduce that liability for humiliation is not because of the victim's degradation or his family's stigma. Because if either were the cause, you would be liable for humiliating even an immature minor. So liability stems solely from the victim's suffering embarrassment. So with regard to Rav Abba Kamma's case of someone who was humiliated in their sleep, for example, and never awoke, we can for sure rule that the assailant is not obligated to compensate the heirs, because that person is what a feeling of embarrassment is actually what we base the compensation on. So that's the clear-cut answer, and it's nice to get a clear-cut answer. Do any of you guys want to ask a question? You can unmute yourself. Guys? Where's Arthur?
I'm trying to get back to the show. Just give me a second.
Sure.
No, I clicked on something. I can't actually see anybody. So I was going to click back on the link. So anyway, I can get back in. I mean,
Yeah. Gavin, Arthur's going to join. I thought you were just showing your appreciation for the next part of the Gemara, which deals with a blind person. Yes, and we couldn't see you.
Yes, 100%.
I thought that was very clever of you.
Yes, no. I wanted to make it more virtual reality. Absolutely. Yeah.
Exactly. You wanted us to emotionally feel it.
100%.
So we're just waiting for Arthur to come back for a second. Now it's interesting.
Kevin on there.
Yeah, Arthur's coming back.
There's Kevin. Okay.
Just give me 1 second. Arthur, you had a
Sorry,
call.
my phone reset. No, my phone reset. I had something against the button by accident, so it reset the phone by accident.
Okay, no problem. So did you hear, what point did you disappear, mate? What did you hear? What's the bottom line?
I'm recording the show. But that's the part that I'm kidding. No, you were discussing about the different types of embarrassments you get, whether the level of embarrassment was, whether, let's say he was in a public, I will put the fan of his logo there. But the level of embarrassment, well, each area has a different level of embarrassment, whether he's already naked, or whether he's semi-naked in like the face pieces, or if he's like in a market. There's different levels for embarrassment.
All right, let me ask you a question, Arthur.
And also we're talking about the difference between, Karen, yeah?
Rabbi Abba Kamma, what was his question?
I don't remember what Rabbi said. I don't know what my wife says.
All right. So what Rabbi Abba says is as follows: he said, if you embarrass a sleeping person and they die in their sleep, is there liability for damages where you have to pay to the heirs of the deceased person? Okay, and that question hinges on two factors. Do we pay this damage because the victim suffered humiliation, in which case if he died in his sleep and never woke to realize he was embarrassed, then he never suffered any sort of embarrassment because he wasn't aware? Or do we say that the family's name and his name was degraded as a result of embarrassment? And if we hold, the bottom line is it's about the victim's awareness of embarrassment and his psychological humiliation, then we cannot pay the heirs because he never woke up to realize he was embarrassed. He died in his sleep. So the example I used was a person that people do a YouTube video of mocking him with shaving cream and mocking him while he was in a drunken stupor, teenage boy, for example. And then he died of alcohol poisoning. Do they have a case against him in YouTube because he embarrassed the family name? Or do they say because he was never aware and he never woke up to it, he never suffered embarrassment, therefore there's no payment for embarrassment? That's the question at hand. And it was going backwards and forwards. And the bottom line is, went to Rabbi Meir, it went to Rebbe, it went to Rav Papa, is that the family does not get the payment because the embarrassment works on the individual that realizes is embarrassed and not on the degradation of the individual or the family. Okay?